There are peoples who accept what they are given. And there are peoples who, when faced with limits, respond. This is one of them. Here the ground was never wide. The land was never generous. The horizon was never guaranteed. And often the cost of continuing was high. Yet when confronted with no, there was never only resignation. There was search. There was persistence. There was the refusal to turn away from adversity. The farmer who sows even when the harvest is uncertain. The fisherman who sails knowing he may not return. The man who works not because it is easy, but because giving up was never an option. The Lusitanian soul was not born from abundance. It was born from effort, from calculation in difficult times, from decisions made when risk was real, from the quiet courage of those who chose to continue even when reward was not guaranteed. It is not an ancient myth. It is a process built across centuries, through sweat, through loss, through difficult choices, and at times through blood. Each generation added a layer to it, not of superiority, but of endurance, not of inevitable destiny, but of will. Perhaps what distinguishes us is the ability to turn no into a path toward yes. Long before there was a kingdom, before flags and defined borders, this land had already learned that survival meant resisting longer than the enemy. Among rugged mountains and difficult valleys, a shepherd became a leader. He did not command empires. He did not possess legions. He had only free men and harsh terrain. He stood against Rome, one of the greatest military machines of the ancient world. He did not offer submission. He offered resistance. Viriato does not represent conquest. He represents refusal to disappear, the refusal to accept defeat, that destiny had been decided by others. Roman chroniclers themselves recorded the difficulty. They spoke of an indomitable people, of cunning warriors, of men difficult to control, and yet Rome would eventually prevail. Viriato did not fall in a great final battle. According to ancient accounts, he was betrayed by men from his own circle. The resistance ended, but the mark remained. There a sign began to take shape, not of domination, but of persistence, a way of being that centuries later would rise again, whenever existence itself was at stake. And that resistance did not disappear with Viriato, it transformed. For centuries, this territory lived between greater forces, between powers that overlapped, between cultures that blended together. But persistence was not lost. Gradually, it ceased to be merely reaction. It began to become will. In the 12th century, a young noble dared to ask a question that would change everything. What if this territory were not merely a margin? What if it stood at the center of its own destiny? Dom Afonso Henriques did not inherit a kingdom. He built it himself. He did not begin from abundance. He did not begin from external consensus. He began from risk. Henriques is not merely a battle. It is an affirmation. The affirmation that this people would not exist only because they resisted. They would exist because they chose. There the Lusitanian soul gained a new layer. It was no longer only refusal. It was will of its own, not merely to survive, but to exist by itself. And that decision would carry consequences. Because to affirm oneself is always more difficult than to simply resist. Affirmation did not bring tranquility. It brought risk, and that risk would soon be tested. Nearly 2 centuries after Henriques, that fragile kingdom trembled once more. With the death of a king came a dynastic succession crisis. The real possibility that Portugal might cease to exist as an independent entity. It was not merely a dispute of crowns. It was a question. Had it all been worth it? This time it was not only nobles or lineages at stake. It was the people, farmers and artisans, common men. And it was there at Aljubarrota that the test became proof. The proof that the decision taken in the 12th century had not been a fleeting impulse. It was conviction. There the Lusitanian soul gained another layer. No longer only will, but collective defense. Not merely decision, but commitment. When everything could have collapsed, it did not retreat. And once again, faced with no, it sought the path toward yes. The proof consolidated the kingdom. Aljubarrota secured continuity. But continuity is not destiny. It is merely permanence. Reigns passed and generations with them, and Portugal endured. But it had not been born to remain still. The soul that had learned to resist began to seek dimension. For centuries, the sea had been a frontier. It became purpose, not merely a space to cross, but an assumed project. The ocean was unknown, and the unknown is not merely distance. It is fear. Fear of what cannot be seen. Fear of what cannot be measured. Fear of what may have no return. Violent currents, storms without warning, capes that seemed like the end of the world. The navigators dared to confront Adamastor. They crossed the Cape of Storms. They challenged not only the waves, but the imagination of their time. To face the sea was to face the human limit. And yet they continued, not out of blind impulse, but out of conscious will. Under the strategic vision of Prince Henry, nothing was improvised. It was planned. Cartographers were gathered. Winds were studied. Instruments refined. Ships built to endure weeks, months, even years upon the ocean. They learned to read the stars, to measure latitudes, to transform uncertainty into calculation. There, courage met method. And when courage meets method, the impossible begins to yield. From the 15th century onward, and throughout the 16th century, this western edge of Europe became a center of navigation, a center of cartography, a center of nautical innovation, a center connecting continents. Portugal did not merely open routes, it gave worlds to the world. It redefined distances. It linked oceans. It built bridges where there had once been emptiness. Centuries later, it would find words in these verses by Camões, where the land ends and the sea begins. He was not inventing an identity. He was recognizing it and giving it a stature that would outlive his own time. There, the Lusitanian soul revealed its boldest form, the capacity to confront the unknown, not as a threat, but as possibility. And in doing so, it proved that greatness does not depend on the size of territory, but on the size of will. But no historical peak remains untouched. The 16th century brought centrality. It brought wealth. It brought projection. But it also brought tension. From the middle of that century onward, the Inquisition marked the territory, not only as an institution, but as a climate of suspicion, of surveillance, and of fear. The soul that had learned to dare upon the sea now began to live under control on land. Trust began to narrow, and then came the blow. On the fields of Alcácer-Quibir, ambition surpassed prudence. The king became a myth, and the country became a shadow. Yet even in the shadow, memory refused to die. The future became uncertain. What had been projection turned into fragility. 2 years later, the Portuguese crown passed into foreign hands. The Iberian Union did not erase Portugal, but it suspended its decision. 60 years under Habsburg rule, and it is in suspension that identity is tested. Even within that instability, for moments it was questioned, but it did not dissolve. The language endured. Customs persisted. Memory remained alive. The restoration of 1640 was not a sudden impulse. It was matured fidelity. It was not uncontrolled revolt. It was conscious recovery. When independence returned, it was not merely a change of dynasty. It was the confirmation that the Lusitanian soul can pass through shadow without losing its sense of itself. There it gained another layer. No longer only boldness, no longer only defense, but historical persistence. The capacity to cross instability, to question itself, and still move forward. That very fidelity had secured continuity. The kingdom had endured. Identity had survived the shadow. But history does not test only through politics. Sometimes it tests through nature itself. A century later, on All Saints' Day, on a clear morning when nothing foretold collapse, the earth shook. It was not invasion. It was not war. It was not human decision. It was the ground giving way. Buildings collapsed. Streets split open. The sea withdrew and returned as a devastating force. What centuries had built disappeared in minutes. There, the Lusitanian soul did not face an army. It faced emptiness. It faced loss and fear, the silence after the roar. For a moment, everything seemed suspended, yet it did not end there. To resist an enemy is one thing. To resist the force of nature itself is another. Among the ruins, a decision rose. Bury the dead. Care for the living. Rebuild the city, not with prolonged lament, not with fatalism, but with firmness, with method, with straight lines drawn over chaos. There the soul gained another layer. Not only resistance, not only fidelity, but lucid pragmatism, the capacity to turn ruin into project, to draw a future over destruction, and to prove that even when the ground fails, the will can remain firm. And from that firmness, the city was rebuilt. Reason organized the chaos. Portugal remained standing. Yet stability is never permanent. At the beginning of the 19th century, the threat returned, not by way of the sea, not by the trembling of the earth, but by the march of armies. The Napoleonic invasions were not merely military confrontation. They were imposition, and once again the soul was called to decide. The territory was crossed. The court departed. Power relocated, but the people remained. Farmers burned their crops so that the enemy would not feed. Villages were emptied and roads became traps. Militias were formed and entire people under arms. It was not staged epic. It was silent resistance. Portugal ceased to be merely soil. It became collective will. Even when power withdrew, identity did not. There another layer was added. No longer only reconstruction, no longer only fidelity, but popular resistance. The certainty that the homeland does not live only in palaces, nor in borders drawn upon a map. It lives in the intimate decision not to accept being erased. That popular resistance had secured continuity. Yet the 19th century would bring new upheavals. Kings passed on. Internal wars divided the country. Liberals and absolutists confronted one another. External conflicts followed. The Lusitanian soul was no longer called only to resist. It was called to understand itself. And there are moments in history when the battle ceases to be fought on the field and begins to be fought in the conscience. It was then that the homeland began to be thought, not merely defended, not merely rebuilt, but truly thought. Camões had given it epic stature, but now it had to be questioned. Fernando Pessoa looked at the lost empire and refused easy lament. In Message, he transformed absence into symbolic project. He spoke of a fifth empire, not of territory, but of spirit. To be Portuguese for him was not to possess the world. It was to be a bridge between the visible and the invisible. Eduardo Lourenço later looked at that same soul and had the courage to question it. He spoke of longing, not as passive nostalgia, but as awareness of absence. He taught us that identity is not comfort. It is permanent interrogation. And Jose Saramago brought the soul back to the earth, to the stone, to the peasant, to collective memory. He reminded us that identity is not built only with kings and heroes, but with anonymous men and women who persist. There, the Lusitanian soul gained another layer. No longer only resistance, no longer only will, but reflection, the capacity to look at itself without illusion and still continue. And yet the Lusitanian soul is not exhausted by the names that thought it. More voices shaped it. More consciences inhabited it. Kings and soldiers, navigators and poets, thinkers, but also the anonymous farmer who worked the land without allowing it to defeat him. The fisherman who departed without promise of return. The worker who built cities he would never sign. Each one added something invisible to that feeling difficult to explain and impossible to deny, a way of being that is distinctly ours. More names could be mentioned, more works, more deeds accomplished. But the Lusitanian soul does not belong only to those who remained in history. It belongs to all those who, in silence, who simply continued. There are things that cannot be explained. They are felt. After battles, after reconstructions, after reflections, the Lusitanian soul found its voice. Not in treaties, not in proclamations, but in song. Fado does not promise victory. It does not promise the future. It does not promise redemption. It acknowledges loss. It accepts absence and transforms it into beauty. And in that search for a voice, a figure emerged who gave a face to the invisible. Amalia Rodriguez was not merely a performer. She was a point of convergence. In her, the word of the poets descended into the streets, and the lament of the people rose to the stage. She gave voice where the soul ached, proving that the erudition of Portuguese poetry could vibrate in the very same throat that sang of ordinary life. It is not resignation. It is emotional lucidity. It is the capacity to look at destiny without denying it and still sing it. There the soul did not gain strength. It gained depth because a people that learns to sing its pain also learns to master it. And in doing so, it proves that to resist is not only to fight. It is to feel and to continue. Across the centuries, the Lusitanian soul has been tested in many ways. By war and by ambition, by loss and by nature, by exile and by doubt. Ease was never promised to it. Centrality was never guaranteed. And yet it endured, not because it never fell, but because it never dissolved. It refused to disappear. It refused to fall silent. It refused to forget itself. It turned fear into crossing, shadow into fidelity, ruin into project, division into reflection, and pain into song. Each generation added something to it. Not absolute power, not untouchable purity, but density. Today it may no longer sail to conquer oceans. It may no longer rebuild cities upon ashes. It may no longer confront empires in arms, but it continues to do what it has always done. Respond to the limit, and perhaps that is its true permanence. In an unstable world, in an accelerated time, in an era of uncertainty, there is value in one who learned from early on to live within risk, without losing direction. The Lusitanian soul is not a monument. It is not a myth sealed in the past. It is a practice. It is the capacity to turn no into a path. And as long as there are those who sow even in doubt, who depart even without guarantees, who build even after the fall, that soul will continue, not as nostalgia, but as choice.